December 31st, 1942. The North Pole is 250 miles away from the Barren Sea. British warships had just destroyed a German destroyer. There were 38 males in the water. They had 12 minutes before they perished from hypothermia. A 24-year-old gunnery officer named Klaus Richter clung to broken deck plating in the frigid water, which felt like knives piercing his clothes. 37 additional sailors from the destroyer Z-16 Friedrich Eckold fought against waves that threatened to submerge them with each surge. 40 minutes ago, British shells had destroyed their ship. Klaus's hands were now gray. He was no longer able to feel his feet. In training, he had learned that hypothermia in these conditions may result in death within 12 to 15 minutes. He was already 20 years old. But his greatest fear was not the cold. Through shivering teeth, Klaus saw the bright hull of an American Coast Guard cutter stand out against the black ocean as it emerged from the smoke and ice fog. During long night watches, he had overheard the crew whispering stories about what Americans did to U-boat crews they fished from the Atlantic. Photographs purporting that the Americans either abandoned survivors to drown or, worse, used them as targets, had been presented to them by his propaganda officer. Maschinenfreiter Matt Joseph Weber, clinging to the same wreckage, gasped, "They are coming for us." The young mechanic's eyes were wide with fear unrelated to the cold, and his lips were bluish. Klaus was unable to dispute since he had accepted all of the misinformation. Were Americans not uniformed gangsters? Brutal, indifferent to death, and brought up in a violent society. When they could just let the Arctic do the work for them, why would they spend valuable medical supplies and warm bunks on enemy sailors? The engines of the cutter became louder. Now, Klaus could see people moving on the deck, gesturing to the German survivors strewn all over the turbulent ocean. His mother in Hamburg would never know what had happened to him, he thought. He pictured Elsa, his girlfriend, waiting for letters that would never arrive. This was the end, not from Arctic cold or British shells, but from American cruelty. 50 years later, the events that followed would bring tears to his eyes each time he related this tale. Captain Ralph Ely skillfully navigated the 165-foot cutter through the ice chunks and debris field, while the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Northland approached with impressive accuracy. Klaus watched as sailors lined the rail, his teeth trembling violently now. He awaited the appearance of guns and the promised casual violence. Rather, life rings and ropes splashed into the surrounding water. "Hang on!" An American sailor attempting to speak his native German yelled, "Schnell! Schnell!" with a strong accent. Klaus struggled with the life ring with his freezing fingertips. He was unable to get it to function properly. He had lost all of his strength and coordination due to the cold. He was going to drown before anyone could save him. His body had also deceived him. Then he was seized by hands. He was drawn into life by powerful American hands. Klaus was younger than the two American sailors who had descended into the water. Even though they were dressed in survival suits, Klaus could tell that they were grimacing from the cold. To get to him, they ran the risk of getting frostbite. "I have you covered." "Hang on," one person said in English. The tone pierced Klaus's dread, even though he could not understand the words. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't a victory. The voice sounded urgent and worried, like someone attempting to save a life. They shoved him in the direction of the ladder. He was hauled up like a bag of wet grain by hands from above that seized his uniform. Klaus's legs wouldn't function. He was unable to assist them. He was worthless, defeated, and dead weight. They had given up on him even though every muscle in his body had given up. Second-class petty officer, after pulling Klaus over the rail, William Harrison covered him with wool blankets right away. "Corpsman, get him down. Right now, we need you." Exertion had flushed Harrison's face, and in the cold air, vapor was escaping his mouth. He was perhaps 20 years old, and his gentle eyes were devoid of any hatred or joy at having captured an adversary. With blankets wrapped around him, Klaus lay on the deck and saw the American crew's feverish efficiency through blurry vision. They were pulling more Germans out of the sea. Next across the rail were Weber, Obermont Hans Gruber, and young Friedrich Kessler, who could not have been older than 17. Klaus anticipated seeing the real face of American brutality at this very time. The masks would undoubtedly come off now that they had the weak and defenseless Germans on board. Thomas Chun, a Coast Guard corpsman, crouched next to Klaus. Klaus recoiled, anticipating agony as he held medical scissors. Rather, Chun meticulously removed Klaus's frozen military jacket. Chun murmured quietly, "Easy, easy," his Asian-American visage displaying just professional concern. "We must gently warm you up. We can shock your system if you move too quickly." As he worked, he spoke to Klaus like a patient rather than a prisoner, outlining the process. Klaus's brain was unable to comprehend it. The violence was where? The disdain? The heedless brutality of winners against the defeated? Chun covered Klaus with additional blankets. They had a scent of safety and soap. He then created a thermos. He mimed taking tiny sips, warm broth, not hot. When the liquid touched Klaus's lips, he tasted rich, life-giving beef broth. Warmth coursed through his chest, causing his body to tremble. As Klaus's trembling hands attempted and failed to hold the cup themselves, Chun patiently held his head. Someone yelled from the rail, "38. Captain, there are 38 German survivors." Klaus observed Captain Ely moving among the Germans who had been rescued, examining each one individually. The captain, who appeared to be around 45, had a worn face that was marked by both experience and something else Klaus was unable to identify. Ely knelt down and made eye contact with Klaus. "You are safe now," Ely stated slowly in English before attempting to say, "Seen sit you're safe," in broken German. Klaus gazed at this American captain, attempting to make sense of what he was going through in light of everything he had been taught. With a fleeting smile, the captain put a genuine hand on Klaus's shoulder before moving on to the next man. Where was the adversary that Klaus had been ready to confront? Klaus noticed a picture of a girl in a sundress, grinning at the camera tacked above the berth they had given him below deck in the Northland S crew quarters. The girlfriend of someone. An American had sacrificed his own berth for an enemy. This had been a sailor's bed. Corpsman Chun came back with wool jumpers, American Coast Guard dungarees, and dry cloths. Chun sheepishly pointed to their size and stated, "They will be too big." However, they were dry and warm. The anguish was unbearable when Klaus's fingers regained feeling. Chun looked closely at his hands to see if they had frostbite. He said, "You are lucky," but Klaus didn't think Chun would comprehend. "No long-term harm. You will keep your fingers, even if they will hurt like hell for a few days." The attention to detail, professionalism, and compassion were evident. According to several regulations, this was not the bare minimum of care. This was medicine administered by a physician who sincerely cared about the health of his patients, even if those patients were dressed as enemies. Why are they doing this? Joseph Weber, who was on the adjacent bunk, kept whispering to Klaus, "What do they desire from us?" Klaus was at a loss for words. Klaus will never forget the extraordinary event that occurred that first evening when the Northland raced away from the conflict area toward its base in Iceland. The American crew was eating roast beef, mashed potatoes, green beans, and fresh bread when Petty Officer Harrison brought them hot meals, real food, not survival rations. Harrison pointed to the potatoes and remarked, "My mother's recipe." He took a picture out of his wallet and showed it to Klaus and Weber. It showed a middle-aged woman grinning at the camera while standing in front of a white farmhouse. Harrison pointed to the picture and then to himself and said, "Iowa, the Bowenhoff farm. Having taken some English classes in school, Weber was able to your mom?" Harrison's expression brightened. "Yes, Mom. I'm sure she's terribly worried about me." He pretended to be concerned. then chuckled. Mothers worry, don't they? American mothers and German mothers are the same. Even though it was such a straightforward occasion, it caused Klaus to open up. Like Klaus, this American sailor had someone's son, had a worried mother, likely had a girl back home, friends and aspirations beyond this conflict. He had risked going into frigid water to save him. These moments multiplied over the course of the next 3 days as the Northland approached Iceland. Klaus and a few other Germans learned how to play poker with matches as chips from Seaman First Class Danny Rodriguez. Although they had limited verbal communication, the universal language of poker betting and bluffing transcended words. Rodriguez slapped his forehead after losing a hand. "Scheiße," he murmured in awful German. Klaus chuckled. He hadn't laughed in months. On the second night, Lieutenant James Morrison offered Klaus his pack of cigarettes. Watching the northern lights dance across the Arctic sky, they stood on deck under supervision but without a guard. After lighting Klaus's cigarette, Morrison ignited his own. Two men stood in friendly silence for a few minutes, taking in one of nature's most breathtaking spectacles. "Isn't that beautiful?" At last, Morrison spoke. "Makes you wonder what all of us are fighting over." Klaus understood the sentiment, even though he didn't understand the words. Language hurdles were broken by Morrison's tone of voice, motion toward the lights, and small shake of his head. The 17-year-old German sailor Friedrich Kessler developed a special bond with Corpsman Chen. Throughout the rescue, Kessler had been terrified, sobbing and yelling for his mother. That first night, Chen had spent hours sitting with him, holding his hand and comforting him with soft, incomprehensible English. Even though he was officially a prisoner, on the third day, Kessler was following Chen around like a younger brother, supporting the corpsman in his work. Chen gave him some medical vocabulary in English. Chen learned German phrases from Kessler in exchange, and they both laughed at each other's pronunciations. Twice a day, Captain Ely made it a point to see the German survivors. Conversations were eventually made possible by Weber's complex hand signals and poor command of English. Ely clarified that after being transported to Iceland, they will be moved to a suitable POW institution. Ely carefully stated, "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention," which Weber partially translated. "Yes, you are inmates, but you are also sailors. Our shared enemy is the sea. It attempted to murder you yesterday. We don't have to complete its task." As Ely spoke, Klaus observed his expression. This was not a show for an imagined audience, nor was it propaganda. This was just what these Americans and this man thought. Their shared opponent is the sea. Everything was reframed by that one simple sentence. In his desk drawer, Captain Ely stored a letter from his mother dated December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. "Do not become what you are fighting against," she had written. Before making any tough choice, including this one, he read it. As Klaus's body healed from its near-death experience, his mind struggled with the increasing understanding that everything he had been told about Americans was untrue. They weren't violent mob bosses. They included officers like Morrison, who quoted poetry and valued the beauty of nature, farm lads like Harrison, city kids like Rodriguez, and children of immigrants like Chen, whose parents had come to America in search of a better life. They were men who taught prisoners card games, shared their cigarettes, gave up their bunks for adversaries, exhibited pictures of their mothers, and fretted about their frostbitten fingers. For these individuals, the Geneva Convention meant more than just words. They saw it as a framework, a set of laws that distinguished the civilization from barbarism. Klaus has heard German officers write down the convention as foolish idealism that should be disregarded when it was inconvenient. However, these Americans behaved as though providing decent treatment to inmates was just the right thing to do. One evening, Weber expressed what they were all thinking. "Klaus, they are superior to us. According to our propaganda, we were the superior civilization and the master race. However, These Americans handle vanquished adversaries better than we do. It was a hard reality to accept. Klaus was notably affected by one incident. Obermatt Gruber fell on the evening of January 2nd. His age of 43 and the stress of the rescue proved to be too much. His heart started to fail. To stabilize Gruber, Corpsman Chun labored non-stop for 3 hours. When Chun's understanding ran out, Captain Ely called a Navy hospital in Iceland to arrange for a physician to walk Chun through more complex procedures. Every member of the ship's crew appeared committed to save the life of this German sailor. They were successful. Gruber made it through the journey and the night. He was taken right away to a hospital in Iceland, where American medical professionals began to treat him. Why? As they carried him aboard the ambulance, Gruber asked once a week through Weber's translation, "Why save the enemy?" Chun simply shook his head, worn out after working all night. "Because we do that. That's what medical professionals do. It makes no difference what uniform you wear." The third day on board the Northland was January 2nd, 1943. A mail call was received by Seaman Rodriguez. From the other side of the mess hall, Klaus saw Rodriguez's eager face as he tore open an envelope. Then Klaus witnessed it. Rodriguez's face broke. He let go of the letter. He stared at nothing as he stood motionless. After reading the letter, another sailor placed a hand on Rodriguez's shoulder. Rodriguez dismissed it and went to cry in solitude. Radio was slower than the ship's network of rumors. Every man on board learned within an hour that German forces had slain Rodriguez's younger brother near Kasserine Pass. Klaus's stomach dropped. It was this. The mast collapsed at this point. Rodriguez had every excuse to vent his sorrow on the handy German detainees on his ship. Klaus was unable to eat or sleep. He was aware of what he would do in Rodriguez's shoes. He recalled how French Poles in German captivity were treated with disdain when German soldiers were slain. He recalled that in retribution for partisan attacks, Polish Poles were forced to work to death. He recalled ignoring pain that he could have avoided. The hours passed slowly. Rodriguez did not go back to the mess hall. He didn't show up on deck. Klaus observed the tense expressions of guys mourning a loved one and glimpses of American sailors consoling their pal. It grew dark. The regular poker match was called off. Nobody was brave enough to do it. As they waited for the hammer to fall, Klaus and the other Germans remained silent in their rooms. Rodriguez then emerged through the door. He had crimson eyes. He drew his face. He appeared to have aged 10 years in a single day. The deck of cards was in his possession. Klaus gasped for air. Weber turned pale. This was the time. At this point, they would find out how much their uniform actually cost. Rodriguez took a seat at the table. His hands were trembling. He avoided looking at Klaus. Didn't give the Germans a glance. He just sat there with the cards for a long time. He then dealt. Klaus broke down in tears. He was unable to stop. Klaus was unable to respond when Weber inquired what was wrong. He was watching this American deal cards for a poker game with the adversary, whose sadness was so intense it emanated from him like heat, and whose brother he might have killed. At last, Rodriguez raised his head. He looked Klaus in the eye. There was only humanity, weariness, and pain. No hate. "Your wager," Rodriguez said. With trembling hands, Klaus stretched out and set his matches down on the table. That night, they played almost silently. Rodriguez played fairly and refrained from making his typical jokes or slapping his forehead when he lost. He followed the guidelines. He continued to handle the Germans in the same manner. Later, long later, Klaus would realize that this was the moment his soul cracked open, not because of the kindness or the rescue, but because he witnessed a man choose decency when he had every right to choose hatred. That evening, Klaus muttered to Weber, "They are so much better than us. They are far superior to us." It wasn't an accident that Klaus was seeing. It was a display of character. These guys represented the wide range of American experiences. Harrison from his farm in Iowa, Rodriguez from the Puerto Rican neighborhood of New York City, Chun, whose parents had come from China in search of opportunity, and Morrison from an affluent Boston family. Because of this diversity, the majority of Americans had first-hand experience with immigration. Being an outsider and seeing that foes were frequently just people caught up in historical mishaps. Rodriguez was teaching Klaus the same lessons that Captain Ely had learned. The U.S. military regarded adherence to the Geneva Convention as a sign of American identity as much as a legal requirement. As the leader of Allied forces in Europe, General Eisenhower had made it clear that Allied treatment of prisoners of war was to be exemplary, not out of fear of reprisals, but because it was the right thing to do. However, this went beyond general orders. The Coast Guard identified itself not only by defeating adversaries, but also by saving lives. The service's motto, Semper Paratus, which means always ready, extended to saving anyone in danger at sea, even if doing so put them in grave danger. The American sailors were doing what they had been trained to do their entire lives when they went into frigid water to rescue the Germans. The treatment of prisoners of war by the Axis stood in stark contrast to this. Over 50% of Soviet prisoners held by the Germans perished. German detainees held by the Soviet Union did not fare much better. Because they saw surrender as disgraceful, Japanese forces frequently refused to accept any prisoners at all. Among the 425,000 German Poles who would survive in American custody was Klaus. His odds are 99.85%. Just 40% of Soviet inmates in German camps made it out alive. There was more to the gap than just numbers. It had to do with philosophy. It was personality. Man by man, camp by camp, ship by ship, the decision was repeatedly made. Even in his loss and in his grief, Rodriguez had made that decision. Klaus Richter had changed since being rescued from the Arctic waters by the time the Northland arrived in Reykjavik on January 4. His perspective on the world had completely changed. I have been captured by the enemy, but I have been saved by decent men. He wrote in a journal entry that night that has been kept in archives. I was misinformed about Americans in every way. They're not savage. They don't act cruelly. They are superior to us in a lot of ways. I am thankful to be alive to witness the truth and ashamed of my beliefs. The young mechanic Weber came to a same realization. We expected to die either from the cold or from American bullets, he remembered in a post-war interview. Rather, they provided us with their food, beds, and medical attention. Instead of treating us like enemies, they treated us as human beings. It caused me to doubt everything about the war and the cause we had been fighting for. The 17-year-old Kessler was possibly the most severely impacted. Later on, he stated that Corman Chun had saved his life twice, once from hatred and once from the Arctic. He demonstrated to me that humanity transcended national boundaries, that compassion could persist even in times of conflict, and that adversaries might turn into allies. I believed I was fighting for a noble cause when I enlisted in the Marines. Chun taught me that human dignity is the only worthwhile cause. Klaus Richter, a German naval officer in the American heartland, spent the rest of the war in a camp for prisoners of war in Kansas. He studied English, worked on farms, and, once mail service was restored, wrote letters home. He silently took in American culture, put it aside, and allowed it to transform him. Klaus was sent back to Germany in 1946. When he returned to Hamburg, his mother was living in a cellar, his city was in ruins, and his nation had been completely vanquished. However, he had hoped something that other Germans lacked. Klaus worked as a translator for American occupying forces, using his proficiency in English. He turned to become a champion of goodwill between Germany and the United States, putting forth great effort to mend fences between formerly adversaries.